The story of how my marriage fell apart starts long before the actual wedding day. Let me paint you a picture of how everything seemed perfect, and how those moments led up to the devastating betrayal at the very moment that was supposed to mark the beginning of our happily ever after. I met Emily during our college years. It was one of those whirlwind romances, the kind where everything just clicks. She had this magnetic energy, the type that draws everyone into her orbit. When she walked into a room, people noticed, not just because of her beauty but because of her charisma. I was no different. I was captivated from the very start. We fell hard and fast, spending every moment together. From late-night study sessions to weekend getaways, we were inseparable. Our relationship moved quickly. After just 2 years, I proposed to her on a snowy December night under the city lights. It felt like a movie, with her tears of joy and the way she jumped into my arms when she said yes. It was perfect, or so I thought. Looking back now, I wonder if I had been swept up in the fantasy of it all, ignoring the small red flags that should have made me pause. Even before the engagement, there were moments that didn't sit right with me. Emily had a close relationship with my brother, Michael. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Michael was the life of every party, always charming and full of jokes. He was the kind of guy who could get along with anyone, and Emily seemed to enjoy his company. They would share inside jokes and laugh about things that I wasn't a part of. It didn't bother me then. If anything, I was glad they got along so well. I imagined it as a sign of how seamlessly Emily was fitting into my family. There were times when I would walk into a room and find them sitting a little too close, their conversation stopping abruptly as I entered. But I trusted both of them completely. Michael was my brother, my best man-to-be, and Emily was the love of my life. Trust wasn't something I ever questioned, until much later. Planning the wedding was supposed to be the happiest time of our lives. Emily took charge of most of the details, throwing herself into the preparations with a kind of feverish excitement. I was happy to let her lead the way, thinking it was just part of her enthusiasm for starting our life together. She spent hours on the phone with the wedding planner, coordinating every little detail. But there were times when she seemed stressed, unusually so. I chalked it up to the pressure of wanting everything to be perfect. During this time, Michael was always around, offering to help with everything. He was a constant presence, showing up to help Emily pick out flowers or taste test the cake. I thought it was a bit strange how involved he was, but I convinced myself it was just his way of being supportive. After all, he'd always been a bit of a show-off, always eager to be the center of attention. The first real crack in the facade appeared during my bachelor party. It was a low-key night at a bar with a few close friends and, of course, Michael. We were drinking, laughing, and reminiscing about old times. Everything was going great until one of my friends, visibly drunk, pulled me aside. He had this look on his face, a mix of pity and hesitation. "Jack, I'm not sure how to say this, but you should keep an eye on Michael and Emily," he slurred, his words tumbling out in a messy rush. "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a sudden pit form in my stomach. He hesitated, then shook his head. "I've just seen the way they look at each other. It's probably nothing, but it doesn't feel right, man." I brushed it off, laughing it away. I trusted them both, didn't I? This was just drunken nonsense, I told myself. Still, a seed of doubt had been planted, and I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me for the rest of the night. The day before our wedding was filled with last-minute preparations and family gatherings. Everyone was in high spirits, or so it seemed. I noticed Michael and Emily disappearing together a couple of times, but whenever I found them, they were just chatting, laughing. I joined them, feeling like the third wheel in my own relationship. Emily's smile was dazzling, her laugh infectious, and I found myself calming down, convincing myself once again that everything was fine. But then there was a moment, a fleeting second when I caught a look between them, a look that felt too intimate. It was as if the rest of the world disappeared for them in that brief exchange. I felt a chill run down my spine but forced myself to ignore it. It was nerves, I told myself. Pre-wedding jitters. the wedding day was a blur of excitement and emotion. Family and friends gathered from all over, the venue was beautifully decorated, and everything seemed perfect. I was nervous, standing at the altar, waiting for Emily. When she finally walked down the aisle, she looked like a vision in white, and all my doubts seemed to melt away. This was it, I thought. We were starting our life together. But there was one moment that felt off, right before the ceremony. Michael pulled me aside, giving me this tight, almost desperate hug. "Congratulations, bro," he said, his voice sounding strained. He pulled back and gave me a look I couldn't decipher. Guilt? Fear? I didn't know then, but I would soon find out. It happened during the reception. Everyone was dancing, drinking, celebrating our union. I lost track of Emily for a while, assuming she was mingling with guests or freshening up. But as the minutes ticked by, I started to get an uneasy feeling. I couldn't find her anywhere. I looked around the venue, checked outside, and finally decided to check the restrooms, just in case she was feeling unwell. That's when I heard it, muffled voices, low laughter, coming from the women's restroom. My heart started pounding as I moved closer, and I recognized the voices immediately. It was Emily and Michael. I pushed open the door without thinking, and there they were. Emily, my new wife, pressed up against the wall, her dress hiked up, and Michael, my brother, his hands on her hips. The shock hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. They looked up, their faces a mixture of surprise and guilt, but there was no denying what I was seeing. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead, it was the day everything fell apart. And that was just the beginning. The world seemed to stop spinning as I stood there, frozen in the doorway of the women's restroom, staring at the scene that was unfolding before me. My mind couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. This was my wife, Emily, my beautiful bride, still wearing her wedding dress. And my brother, Michael. It felt like a nightmare, one of those vivid, twisted dreams where everything is wrong, but you can't wake up. They pulled apart in a sudden, jerky motion, like two teenagers caught in the act. Emily's eyes went wide, her face paling as if she'd seen a ghost. Michael looked away, his expression shifting from shock to something that resembled regret, or was it just annoyance at being caught? I couldn't tell. I was too consumed by a wave of nausea and the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. "Jack, Emily started, her voice cracking. She moved toward me, her hand outstretched, but I stepped back instinctively. Her touch, once comforting, now felt like acid. I couldn't let her touch me, not now. "What the hell is this?" I managed to choke out, my voice sounding foreign and hoarse. It was all I could say, all I could force out as the room spun around me. My legs felt like they were going to give out, but I leaned against the doorframe, trying to steady myself. "It's not what it looks like," Michael blurted out, his voice desperate. He raised his hands as if he could somehow erase what I'd seen, as if his words could undo the image now burned into my brain. I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that echoed off the bathroom walls. "Not what it looks like?" I repeated. "Then what the hell is it, Michael?" "Because it sure as hell looks like my wife and my brother screwing each other at my own wedding." Emily flinched, tears welling up in her eyes. I might have felt sympathy once. I might have wanted to hold her, comfort her, if she were crying for any other reason. But now her tears just made me feel sick. "Jack, please," she said, her voice trembling. She stepped forward, trying to close the gap between us, but I couldn't let her. I stepped back again, hitting the wall behind me, feeling trapped. "Let me explain." "Explain?" I spat, the word coming out as a snarl. "Explain what, Emily? That you couldn't even wait until the ink on the marriage certificate dried before screwing my brother? Is that what you want to explain?" Her face crumpled, and she covered her mouth with her hand, trying to stifle a sob. But I wasn't moved. I wasn't going to be swayed by her tears this time. Michael, on the other hand, seemed to regain some of his composure. He stepped forward, putting himself between Emily and me, as if he could protect her from the rage boiling inside of me. "Jack, calm down," he said quietly. "We didn't mean for this to happen. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" I repeated, my voice rising. I could feel my control slipping, the anger bubbling over. "You call this a mistake? You're my brother, Michael. My best man. And you did this? Here? Now?" Michael's face twisted into a grimace, and he glanced at Emily, who was crying openly now, her shoulders shaking. He let out a deep sigh, as if he were the one suffering, as if this whole situation was somehow hard on him. "I'm sorry, Jack," he said finally, his voice strained. "I never wanted this to happen. I didn't want to hurt you." I laughed again, a sharp, broken sound that left my throat raw. "Didn't want to hurt me? Well, congratulations, Michael. You succeeded anyway." The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear the distant sound of music from the reception hall, the muffled laughter and clinking glasses of our guests, our family and friends, blissfully unaware of the disaster unfolding in this small, sterile bathroom. Emily finally found her voice, stepping forward again, her hands clasped in front of her like she was begging for forgiveness. "Jack, please," she whispered. "I love you. I never wanted this to happen. It just..." "Just what?" I interrupted, my voice cutting through the air like a knife. "It just happened? You just slipped and fell into each other's arms?" Her face crumpled again, and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably now. Michael put a hand on her shoulder, trying to comfort her, and that was the last straw for me. Seeing him touch her, seeing her lean into his touch, it broke something inside me. I lunged forward without thinking, shoving Michael hard against the wall. His head hit the tile with a dull thud, and he winced, but he didn't fight back. He just raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Hit me if it makes you feel better," he said, his voice low and resigned. "I deserve it. I wanted to. God, I wanted to." My fist was clenched, shaking with the urge to wipe that look off his face. But I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to hit him, because despite everything, he was still my brother. The brother I'd grown up with, the brother I'd trusted with my life, and he'd betrayed me in the worst possible way. I stepped back, breathing hard, my vision blurry with tears I refused to let fall. "You deserve worse," I said quietly, my voice barely more than a whisper. I turned to Emily, who was still crying, her mascara smudged, her veil askew. She looked like a broken doll, crumpled and pathetic. But I couldn't find it in myself to feel pity. Not anymore. "You," I said, my voice cold and sharp. "You destroyed everything. Everything we had, everything we were supposed to build together." "For what? For him?" She didn't respond. She couldn't. She just shook her head, her lips trembling as she tried to speak but failed. I took a deep breath, trying to find some semblance of calm. It wasn't working. My whole body was trembling, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them coherent. "I can't do this," I muttered, more to myself than to them. I turned on my heel and stormed out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance between myself and the wreckage of my life as possible. As I stepped back into the reception hall, the music and laughter hit me like a physical blow. People were dancing, drinking, celebrating what they thought was the start of a beautiful marriage. And there I was, standing at the edge of it all, feeling like a ghost in my own life. I walked straight to the bar, ignoring the concerned looks of the guests as I downed a glass of whiskey in one gulp. It burned, but it didn't numb the pain. Nothing would. I could still see their faces, hear their voices. The image of Emily pressed against the wall, Michael's hands on her hips, it was seared into my mind, a permanent scar that would never heal. And as I stood there, staring into my empty glass, I realized something with a cold, sinking certainty. This was only the beginning of the nightmare. The cold sting of whiskey burned down my throat, but it wasn't enough to dull the sharp, gnawing pain inside me. I slammed the empty glass on the bar, signaling the bartender for another. He gave me a hesitant look, sensing the storm brewing within me, but he filled the glass anyway. I stared into the amber liquid, watching the light catch on the surface, swirling like the chaos inside my head. I couldn't go back into that bathroom. I couldn't face Emily and Michael again, not after what I'd seen. I felt like I was walking through a fog, detached from reality, while the world around me continued as if nothing had happened. I could hear the laughter of our guests, the clinking of champagne glasses, the band playing our song, a song that now felt like a cruel joke. This was supposed to be our perfect day, and instead, it had turned into the darkest moment of my life. I felt a hand on my shoulder, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I spun around, expecting to see Michael or Emily, but instead, it was my friend, Eric. He had this look on his face, part concern, part confusion. He'd been my best friend since college, my go-to guy for everything. He was the one who helped me plan this wedding, who assured me that everything would go smoothly. And now here he was, standing in front of me, oblivious to the fact that everything had already fallen apart. "Jack, you okay, man?" he asked, his brow furrowed. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. How could I possibly explain what had just happened? How could I tell him that my entire world had imploded in the space of a few seconds? I just shook my head, swallowing the lump in my throat. He glanced around, lowering his voice. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What's going on?" "I need air," I muttered, brushing past him before he could ask more questions. I couldn't stand the pity in his eyes, couldn't bear the thought of explaining this nightmare to anyone. Not yet. Not while the shock was still fresh, like an open wound. I pushed through the crowd, ignoring the friendly faces, the well-wishers who tried to grab my arm and congratulate me. Their words felt like knives, twisting deeper into my chest. I finally made it outside, stumbling into the cool night air. It was a stark contrast to the warmth of the reception hall, and for a moment, I just stood there, breathing it in, trying to ground myself. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the venue's garden. It was beautiful, serene, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. I could hear the faint sound of the band playing inside, the muffled laughter of our guests. I wondered if anyone had noticed my absence yet, if they were starting to realize that something was wrong. I leaned against a stone pillar, closing my eyes, trying to block out the images flashing through my mind. Emily's flushed face, Michael's hands on her, the way they looked at each other. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. How long had this been going on? Had they planned this? Had they been laughing at me behind my back the whole time? The door behind me creaked open, and I tensed, expecting to see one of them. But it was my mother. She looked at me, her expression shifting from joy to concern in an instant. I must have looked like a wreck, pale, shaking, on the verge of breaking down. "Jack," she said softly, stepping closer. "What's wrong? What happened?" I couldn't lie to her. Not to my mother. The tears I'd been holding back finally welled up, spilling down my cheeks as I looked at her. Her face crumpled, and she reached out, pulling me into her arms like she used to when I was a child. I buried my face in her shoulder, feeling the raw pain clawing its way out of my chest. They betrayed me," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Emily and Michael." I caught them together. Her arms tightened around me, and I could feel her body stiffen with shock. "No," she breathed, her voice filled with disbelief. "No, that can't be." "Are you sure, Jack?" "I saw it," I choked out. "I walked in on them. They didn't even try to deny it." She pulled back, looking into my eyes, her own filled with tears. "Oh, Jack," she whispered, cupping my face in her hands. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say." There was nothing to say. Nothing could fix this, nothing could undo what I'd seen. I took a step back, wiping the tears from my face, trying to pull myself together. I can't go back in there, I said. I can't face them. I need to leave. Leave, she repeated, her eyes widening. But Jack, everyone's inside. The guests, the family, they're expecting you and Emily. I don't care, I snapped, harsher than I intended. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I can't do this, Mom. I can't pretend everything is okay. Not after what just happened. She nodded slowly, her own tears spilling over. Okay, she said softly. We'll figure something out. I'll handle it. I turned and started walking toward the parking lot, not looking back. I could hear my mother's voice, strained and choked with emotion, as she headed back inside. She was going to try to smooth things over, to come up with some excuse for why the groom had disappeared from his own wedding. But I didn't care about the excuses. I just needed to get away. I made it to my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I slid into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel, taking deep, ragged breaths. The urge to scream, to punch something, was overwhelming. But I couldn't. I was too numb, too shattered to do anything but sit there, staring blankly out the windshield. Then I saw them. Emily and Michael, standing by the entrance to the venue. She was still crying, her hands clasped together as if in prayer, while Michael stood next to her, his expression a twisted mask of regret. They were looking for me. I could see it in their eyes, the way they scanned the parking lot, searching for a glimpse of me. For a split second, our eyes met. Emily's face crumpled even more, and she took a step forward, as if she was going to run to me. But I started the car, revving the engine. I couldn't listen to her apologies, couldn't hear whatever pathetic excuse they had concocted. I slammed on the gas, peeling out of the parking lot, leaving a trail of dust in my wake. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of Emily collapsing into Michael's arms, her body racked with sobs. It was the last image I saw before I tore my eyes away and focused on the road ahead. I drove for hours that night, with no destination in mind. The city lights blurred past me as I sped down the highway, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them making sense. My phone buzzed with calls and messages, but I ignored every one of them. I couldn't talk. I couldn't think. All I could do was drive, putting mile after mile between me and the wreckage of what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. After the shock of that night wore off, after the endless hours of driving with nowhere to go, something inside me shifted. The heartbreak, the betrayal, it all slowly gave way to a different emotion. A cold, calculated fury settled deep in my bones. They had taken everything from me. My wife, my brother, they'd humiliated me on what was supposed to be the best day of my life. They didn't deserve to walk away unscathed. I was going to make them pay. I was going to make them suffer the way they made me suffer. The plan begins. I took a week off from work, isolating myself in a cheap hotel far away from home. I needed time, space, and a plan. I shut off my phone, disconnected from everything, and just sat with my thoughts. The anger inside me was like a wildfire, but I knew I couldn't act on impulse. I needed to be smart about this. I needed to hit them where it would hurt the most. First, I started making a list. Michael and Emily, my targets. I wrote down everything I knew about them, every vulnerability, every secret they had shared with me over the years. I went over our past conversations in my mind, picking apart every detail, looking for weaknesses I could exploit. I wasn't going to just hurt them. I was going to destroy their lives. Step 1, gathering evidence. I drove back to our apartment late at night when I knew Emily wouldn't be there. She was likely staying with Michael now, or maybe at her friend's place, trying to avoid the fallout. I still had a key, so I let myself in. The place was a mess, our wedding gifts still piled up, the decorations half torn down. It looked like a battlefield, which seemed fitting. I went straight to the bedroom, to the dresser where Emily kept her personal things. I pulled out her phone from the drawer. She had left it behind that night, probably in her haste. I unlocked it easily, she hadn't even changed the passcode. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction at that. She hadn't even thought far enough ahead to cover her tracks. I scrolled through her messages, and there it was, a long, incriminating thread between her and Michael. They'd been talking for months, planning everything behind my back. There were explicit texts, photos, plans to meet up when I wasn't around. My hands shook as I took screenshots, saving everything. This was my ammunition. Next, I went to Michael's place. I knew he had a stash of weed hidden in his garage, along with a few other questionable substances. It wasn't much, but it was enough for what I had in mind. I took photos of everything, documenting the drugs and paraphernalia, and made sure to put everything back exactly as I found it. Michael had always been reckless, thinking he was untouchable. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Step 2, planting seeds of doubt. I started small, sending anonymous messages to people in their circle, friends, family, coworkers. I crafted each message carefully, making sure they were vague enough to arouse suspicion but detailed enough to be believable. I hinted at an affair, mentioned places I knew they had gone together. I even created fake social media accounts to spread rumors, posting photos and snippets of conversations I'd collected. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. Michael's fiancée, Laura, was one of the first to take the bait. I knew she had her doubts about Michael, she wasn't blind to his flirtatious nature. I sent her an anonymous email with the screenshots of his messages with Emily. I included a note, typed out in a font that looked like it came from a burner email address. "You deserve to know who you're marrying." I could only imagine the look on her face when she saw those texts. A few days later, I heard through the grapevine that Laura had called off the engagement. Michael was furious, storming around town trying to figure out who had sabotaged him. But he had no idea it was me. He thought it was a jealous ex or one of Laura's friends. He never even suspected his own brother. Step 3, the financial blow. Emily was meticulous with our finances. She had access to my bank accounts, knew all the passwords, and handled most of the bills. I'd trusted her completely. That was my first mistake. But now, that knowledge was my weapon. I logged into our joint account and drained every last cent, transferring it to a new account in my name only. I left her with nothing. Next, I called our landlord and told him I was moving out. I paid the early termination fee and made sure to cancel all the utilities. Emily was left scrambling when she came back to find the apartment locked, her access denied, her belongings thrown into garbage bags on the curb. It was petty, sure, but it was satisfying. I wanted her to feel the sting of losing everything in an instant, just like I had. Step 4, public humiliation. For Michael, I needed something bigger, something that would hit him where it hurt the most, his reputation. He was a hotshot real estate agent, always bragging about his sales and his connections. He thrived on the respect people had for him. So, I set up an anonymous tip to the local news, sending them the photos of his drug stash. I made sure to include a detailed account of his activities, painting him as a dealer who was using his position to traffic substances. The story broke within a week. Michael was arrested, dragged out of his office in handcuffs in front of his coworkers. It was all over the news, a local scandal that people couldn't stop talking about. He lost his job, his clients, everything he'd worked for. And I made sure he knew it was me. I sent him a single text after he made bail: "You shouldn't have touched my wife." Step 5, the final confrontation. By the time I was done, they were both ruined. Emily had no money, no place to live, and a reputation in shambles. Michael had lost his job, his fiancée, and was facing legal charges. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction watching it all unfold from a distance. But I wasn't done yet. I needed to face them one last time. I arranged a meeting, sending them both a message from an anonymous number, instructing them to meet me at the bar where Michael and I used to hang out. They showed up, looking haggard and broken. Emily's eyes were swollen from crying, and Michael had a fresh bruise on his cheek. I guessed Laura hadn't taken the breakup well. I sat there, watching them walk in, the realization dawning on their faces as they saw me. They looked at me like I was a stranger, like they didn't recognize the person I had become. "You did this," Michael said, his voice filled with disbelief and fury. "Yes," I replied calmly, taking a sip of my drink. "And I'd do it all again." Emily burst into tears, collapsing into the chair across from me. "Why, Jack?" she sobbed. "Why did you have to destroy us like this?" I leaned forward, meeting her eyes. "Because you destroyed me first. And now, we're even." I stood up, tossing a few bills on the table for the drink, and walked out without looking back. The weight on my chest lifted a little with each step. I didn't know what the future held for me, but one thing was certain: I wasn't the same person I was before. And neither were they.